When I first started earning more money, I felt a rush of relief, a sense that finally, the hard work was paying off. It was like stepping out of a dim room into bright sunlight. I imagined this new salary would be the key to freedom, the ticket to shedding the weight of debt that had clung to me for years. But instead of feeling lighter, I quickly found myself caught in the same old trap. No matter how much extra came in, the bills piled up faster, the balance on my credit cards ballooned, and the sense of dread I thought had disappeared came back stronger and more confusing than ever. How could this be? Rising income, yet growing debt? It felt like a cruel joke. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one night, calculator in hand, scrolling through lists of purchases and trying to make sense of a puzzle with missing pieces. Why am I still drowning? I whispered to myself. The numbers didn't add up. For months, I blamed myself, thinking I must be reckless, undisciplined, or simply incapable of managing money. I was flooded with feelings of shame, frustration, and deep confusion. If more money wasn't the answer, then what was? Where did the extra earnings go? This wasn't just about numbers on a screen. It was about me, my identity, and my relationship with money, a relationship I never truly understood. I can see now that my story is not unique. I've spoken to many people who find themselves stuck in this same paradox, a gradual increase in income matched by an equal or even greater increase in debt. They tell me about the same shame that creeps in, the same frustration that feels like a trap tightening around them. It's tempting to chalk it up to overspending or poor budgeting. But beneath the surface, I realized there's something deeper, a hidden mechanism in how our minds handle money that sabotages progress without us even realizing it. I want to share with you that experience, the strange sensation of gaining ground only to be pulled back, like trying to climb a mountain while the path shifts beneath your feet. You see, the problem is not always about the numbers on our paycheck or the monthly spreadsheet. It's about what's happening inside our heads. When we suddenly have more money, our brains often don't know what to do with it. There's a silent, almost invisible resistance, an old, unconscious setup that keeps money slipping through our fingers just when we think we're getting ahead. And it's not about greed or weakness. It's about how our history, emotions, and beliefs form invisible scripts that whisper to us every time we face financial decisions. These scripts can convince us, without obvious signs, to spend impulsively, to avoid planning ahead, or to take on new debts we don't need. We might not notice the pattern until we feel the crunch, until we realize that despite the higher income, we're still trapped in the same financial loop. I want you to imagine what that feels like for a moment. The exhilaration of more money met with an almost eerie sense of loss, as if the extra dollars have a mind of their own. It's like filling a leaking bucket. No matter how much water you pour in, it escapes before you can fill it. This disconnect between cash flow and financial stability isn't about luck or hard work. It's about the invisible, emotional wiring inside us that governs how money operates in our lives. I remember a time when I thought if only I earned more, all my problems would disappear. I was so focused on changing the external numbers, I never stopped to ask myself what was happening inside, how I was wired to respond to success, how my past had shaped my money habits, how unconscious fears might be quietly sabotaging my efforts. This awakening came slowly, like waking from a vague unease to a clear understanding that the problem had more roots than I initially saw. Throughout this journey, I realized that to truly break free from the cycle, and to allow money to be a tool for freedom instead of anxiety, I had to go beyond the paycheck and into the heart of my mindset. There's a hidden error in how many of us are programmed to react to wealth, and recognizing it is the first step to transforming that reaction. It's a process that involves gentle honesty, deep reflection, and the courage to change not just what we do with money, but how we relate to it inside ourselves. As we move forward together, I want to invite you to hold on to this experience, this feeling of gaining more but not gaining freedom. It's uncomfortable, yes, but within that discomfort lies a powerful opportunity, the chance to see the invisible patterns at play and to rewrite the story that has kept you stuck. The path ahead won't be about quick fixes or magic formulas. It will be about understanding the mental blocks, releasing old fears, and creating a new way to live with money that aligns with who you truly are and who you want to become. So, if you've ever felt the bitter contradiction of earning more without feeling richer, or dreamed of a day when your financial progress doesn't come with strings attached, you're not alone. This is the exact challenge I faced, and the one I'm here to explore with you now. Together, we'll gently uncover the hidden workings of our minds around money and open the door to a new possibility, a financial life where abundance truly means freedom. When I first noticed the dreaded pattern creeping back into my life, it wasn't triggered by some grand financial disaster, but by a seemingly innocent impulse purchase. I had just received a paycheck larger than usual, and while browsing online, a flashy gadget caught my eye. I told myself, I deserve this, and clicked buy without hesitation. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt, as if an unseen force was tugging me in opposing directions. This contradiction puzzled me for weeks. How could I crave financial stability yet sabotage my progress by succumbing to such whims? It dawned on me then that my mind was playing a subtle game, an internal tug-of-war between old conditioning and new circumstances. I realized that these conflicting impulses weren't just isolated events. They were signals from a deeper, habitual interplay operating beneath conscious awareness. For years, my brain had associated possessing a certain sum with particular feelings, sometimes safety, sometimes anxiety, and when that number grew, as it did now, the emotional signals turned chaotic. Unconsciously, I started defending familiar discomfort, much like how a wounded animal reacts in self-protection despite the new environment being safe. Suddenly, I could understand how the increase in resources could activate patterns designed to maintain a status quo, even if it meant reinforcing instability. Through conversations with friends and mentors, I uncovered that this kind of invisible inner conflict is more widespread than I imagined. One person confessed that every time their income climbed, overwhelming stress and nervousness engulfed them, making them reckless with spending or avoidant of budgeting. Another shared how success at work stirred old fears of ridicule for being too greedy, prompting them to funnel funds into charitable donations without personal financial planning. Our minds, it seems, intertwine our self-worth tightly with external financial circumstances, but not always in straightforward or supportive ways. The underlying mechanism seemed to stem from an inner narrative that rejects sudden elevation, as though the psyche is trained to resist changes that threaten established identity. It's a phenomenon akin to a tightly knit tapestry where pulling one thread risks unraveling the whole structure. So the psyche exerts subconscious pressure to preserve the familiar arrangement. In my journey, recognizing this helped me confront the fact that wealth wasn't just currency. It was a mirror reflecting unresolved emotional threads that had entangled themselves in my life's fabric. One evening, I sat by the window, watching city lights flicker far below, feeling both distant from and drawn into those unseen mental battles. I realized that without acknowledging these tugged strings, efforts to shift financial habits were doomed to mimic endlessly spiraling seasons, growth followed by decay, effort defeated by inertia. Financial progress demanded not only a change in external action, but a reweaving of the emotional and cognitive patterns beneath. This insight reframed my view from frustrated expense tracking to observing myself with curiosity and compassion. Rather than treating these inner responses as enemies, I began cataloging moments when old fears bubbled up unexpectedly. For instance, after receiving a bigger paycheck, I noticed an urge to reward myself excessively, an almost compulsive attempt to neutralize the anxiety emerging with prosperity. Understanding this pattern shifted my focus from guilt to inquiry. Why did success provoke discomfort? What memories or beliefs did this discomfort mask? I discovered that certain past experiences, like witnessing adults around me struggle with abundance or punish themselves for spending, had subtly programmed these responses. This process required patience. When I first tried to steer away from impulsive behaviors, the internal resistance flared, restlessness, irritability, even moments of doubt. Yet, each encounter became a learning moment, a quiet invitation to acknowledge and soothe the underlying emotions rather than fight them. I practiced stepping back, breathing, and naming the sensations without judgment. Over time, these small acts of self-awareness transformed old alarms into signals of growth instead of threats. In refining my approach, I began experimenting with emotional check-ins before making purchases or financial decisions. If I noticed unease or compelling urges, I gave myself permission to pause and reflect rather than act immediately. Asking, "What am I feeling right now?" beyond wanting this item often unveiled fears, fear of failure, abandonment, or even undeservedness that had silently directed my wallet. This subtle shift of attention dissolved impulsivity's power, opening space for thoughtful choices aligned with long-term well-being. At work, I carried this new lens with me. On one occasion, after a commendation led to a bonus, I caught myself eyeing lavish spending opportunities, feeling a fast surge of excitement followed by nagging apprehension. Instead of plunging in, I took a walk, journaling my thoughts on an app. Writing out the swirling feelings helped me untangle them, revealing that respecting this internal dialogue allowed me to navigate financial decisions without being driven by subconscious scripts. It was as if I had finally built a bridge between emotion and action, allowing logic and feeling to converse rather than clash. Now, consider how this applies when you face a sudden financial gain or opportunity. Do you notice an instinctive urge to spend, justify, or even reject the change? Are there hidden stories in your mind whispering limitations or fears? Becoming familiar with these undercurrents can help you steer your behavior toward empowerment. It's not about suppressing emotions, but embracing them as guides along your path to stability and abundance. The transformation I experienced didn't come from flipping a switch, but from weaving together awareness, curiosity, and compassion. It required learning to recognize how old emotional landscapes could skew present choices and steadily rewriting those landscapes with patience and kindness. This nuanced healing reshaped my relationship to fiscal growth, turning it into a dance of integration rather than a battle to be won or a puzzle to be solved. In this new chapter, I am no longer caught between excitement and dread when funds arrive. Instead, I approach each financial shift as an invitation to deepen self-understanding, to listen closely to the undercurrents beneath my impulses, and to respond thoughtfully. In this way, the mind moves from reactive patterns toward intentional, liberated engagement with resources. The journey is ongoing, yet I find greater peace in knowing that true progress transcends figures and resides within the harmony cultivated inside. I remember a moment that altered my perspective profoundly. It was a chilly autumn afternoon, and a close friend invited me to a community workshop on behavioral economics. Skeptical at first, I agreed to attend, seeking answers beyond my personal struggle. The speaker, a psychologist specializing in fiscal behaviors, introduced an astonishing concept. Our brains often deploy automatic defenses to guard against discomfort triggered by unfamiliar prosperity. These defenses aren't malicious, but evolved survival strategies misaligned with modern financial realities. He illustrated this with a metaphor comparing our minds to ancient tribes navigating shifting landscapes. Just as a cautious tribe might scatter resources quickly when sensing scarcity to avoid total loss, our inner selves sometimes disperse newfound funds impulsively or unwisely, as a protective measure against perceived threats. Threats rooted not in immediate danger, but in ingrained emotional patterns formed over years. The moment this shifted my understanding was like unlocking a vault I didn't know existed. Up to that point, I had treated my spending patterns like behavioral quirks, but this explanation reframed them as deeply embedded neural rituals actively maintaining a familiar equilibrium. This revelation led me to explore my personal resource distribution system. I realized that my anxieties often flipped a switch in my brain, triggering a chain reaction beyond conscious control. For instance, receiving a bonus would incite a subtle, yet urgent, pressure to allocate funds rashly, a phenomenon I later learned resonates with what experts term primitive scarcity scripts. I found myself rapidly dividing extra income into fragmented uses, a small celebration meal here, unplanned gadgets there, or debts accumulated from past forgetfulness suddenly swelling in priority. My nervous system was orchestrating this frenzy to restore a sense of safety it didn't associate with increase, but with contingency. One afternoon, as golden light filtered through my apartment window, I challenged these ingrained reactions by mapping my impulses onto a flowchart. It began with an emotional cue, excitement intertwined with unease, followed by a wave of rapid justifications for spending. As the lines traced my habitual course, I saw how each decision looped back to an underlying fear, the dread of losing what little I was accustomed to owning. That diagram wasn't just ink on paper. It was a mirror exposing a labyrinth I'd wandered blindly for years. Another striking episode arrived unexpectedly during a visit to a family member's home. Conversations drifted toward ancestral stories of scarcity and survival, their reverberations clearly etched in generational attitudes toward abundance. Listening to tales of deprivation and sacrifice sparked a quiet but intense reflection in me. I recognized how inherited mental frameworks dictated an almost invisible ledger in my psyche, one weighing worthiness, deservingness, and risk in a currency beyond cash. It became evident that my internal narratives were less about current earnings and more about complex inherited beliefs demanding reckoning. This inheritance created a paradoxical dynamic, a simultaneous yearning for security and an unconscious sabotaging of gains. Much like a vine wrapping tightly around a sturdy tree, old ideologies clung to my evolving self, constricting growth even as conditions improved. I started to grasp that without consciously pruning these mental vines, expansion would remain stifled. This acknowledgement forced me to confront parts of myself deeply entwined with survival instincts, shadowed emotions, and a yearning for approval that had silently shaped my choices. Determined to experiment, I began cultivating a practice of deliberately pausing whenever an urge to spend unexpectedly spiked. One evening, after feeling that familiar pull following a freelance project's payout, I resisted rushing into purchases. Instead, I leaned into the discomfort, asking myself what beliefs swirled beneath the impulse. That night, journaling became a tool to track emotional currents, revealing recurring themes of self-doubt and imagined scarcity despite factual abundance. Over time, these sessions illuminated the mental scripts operating just beneath my conscious awareness. I recall a vivid instance when, during such reflection, a memory surfaced of my childhood home, scarce resources pooled carefully by my parents, accompanied by whispered warnings about wastefulness. Recognizing those echoes didn't induce shame but compassion for my younger self and for those who passed down these fears. This empathy opened a channel to gently rewrite my internal narrative, replacing scarcity-driven commands with affirmations of sufficiency and self-respect. Progress wasn't linear. There were moments when the old patterns fiercely reasserted dominance, manifesting as anxiety attacks or reckless spending sprees. But now, equipped with newfound insights, I met these episodes with patience, viewing them as signals of transformation rather than failures. Like a gardener tending to fragile seedlings, I nurtured my evolving mindset with consistent care and mindful attention. With this evolving inner awareness, I began experimenting with visualizations depicting financial well-being, not as distant goals, but immediate realities intertwined with emotional equilibrium. Picturing myself navigating money with calm confidence created a neural blueprint inviting new behavior. Such mental rehearsals subtly rewired my responses, fostering resilient attitudes that withstood previous triggers. As this journey unfolded, I discovered that my money narrative was inseparable from personal identity. Healing fiscal patterns meant untangling stories about self-worth, belonging, and control. Each small victory in aligning thoughts and emotions with constructive actions felt like reclaiming lost terrain, transforming hidden battlegrounds into sanctuaries of empowerment. Now, think of a situation where your income unexpectedly rises or you come into a fiscal opportunity. Imagine approaching it not just as a sum to allocate, but as a test case for the mental frameworks you carry. What ancient messages echo in your responses? How might new understanding help you reinterpret these signals, choosing pathways that serve freedom instead of fear? By engaging with these questions, you invite a profound internal shift, a recalibration that can turn invisible traps into gateways for growth. One evening, I found myself staring at the ceiling, feeling strangely unsettled despite watching my bank balance swell. That quiet disquiet gnawed at me, a sensation not of scarcity, but of unfamiliar excess. It was like stepping into new shoes that pinched in places I hadn't anticipated. This awkwardness wasn't just discomfort. It signaled a fracture between my inner beliefs and external circumstances. My psyche struggled to reconcile this disparity, as if its blueprint for enough was suddenly outdated or mismatched with reality. As days turned to weeks, I noticed a curious pattern emerging. The budget I meticulously crafted would unravel, inexplicably, often after attempts to celebrate progress. One memorable morning, I treated myself to a modest brunch, thinking it well-earned, only to find myself rationalizing impulsive purchases later that day, a spiral that felt less spontaneous joy and more like an invisible tether tightening. This dance between indulgence and guilt created a maze, each turn echoing with conflicting whispers urging caution and celebration simultaneously. During this period, I began encountering conversations about emotional budgeting, a concept that moved beyond numbers to include the subtle, often overlooked energy we bring to money. It suggested that allocation isn't solely analytical, but carries a psychological charge. How we assign meaning to expenses can either anchor us or destabilize us. Fascinatingly, this framework illuminated a pattern in which I allocated funds toward immediate gratification as a way to soothe underlying insecurity, even if such spending betrayed my long-term intentions. One friend described her experience through a metaphor of emotional liquidity, explaining how a sudden influx of cash could flood one's inner reservoir. Overwhelming reservoirs designed for controlled flow. Like a dam bursting, excess funds found unanticipated escapes, often in fleeting purchases or commitments that disguised anxiety or fear beneath excitement or entitlement. Listening to her, I felt a profound connection. My own efforts to channel resources productively were repeatedly undermined by this surging current I wasn't equipped to contain. In exploring this further, I discovered that the muscles of self-regulation are not solely about willpower, but involve cultivating a delicate sensitivity to mood shifts and instinctive cravings. One afternoon, after buying an expensive gadget impulsively, I sat quietly, reflecting on the sensations leading up to that decision. I recognized a pattern of chasing distraction or relief whenever feelings of stress or inadequacy nudged my awareness. This insight shifted how I approached temptation. It wasn't about resisting urges, but understanding their origin and learning to respond with compassion rather than judgment. A particularly revealing instance occurred during a late-night conversation with a colleague who'd faced similar struggles. She shared how envisioning money as an extension of self-worth had trapped her in cycles of guilt and recklessness. Rather than separating identity from income, her emotional self had become intertwined with her bank account, making success feel like a precarious balancing act. Hearing her speak breathed life into my own challenges. I realized that compartmentalizing feelings and finances was a crucial battlefield where true freedom could be won or lost. In a pivotal moment of solitude, I experimented with a novel approach. Instead of associating funds exclusively with security or fear, I began narrating new stories aloud, affirmations framing money as a partner in creative expression and personal growth. As strange as it felt initially, repeating phrases like, "I use my resources to build the life I envision," started softening entrenched resistance. This verbal ritual became a thread weaving through my day, gradually redirecting impulses' energy toward purposeful engagement. During an afternoon stroll, I encountered an unexpected trigger. A billboard advertising luxury items provoked a familiar rush of yearning, followed by unease. Rather than rushing past or succumbing, I paused deliberately, observing the physical sensations, tightened chest, rapid heartbeat, and recognized them as signals, not commands. This embodied awareness allowed me to make a conscious choice to breathe into the discomfort rather than act on it. It felt as though I was retraining my nervous system, shifting from reactive fire to reflective water. Simultaneously, I began to experiment with tempered generosity, deliberately directing portions of income toward causes aligned with my values. The act provided profound satisfaction, but also became a measuring stick for how aligned my spending was with authentic purpose rather than default emotional drives. This practice sparked an unexpected sense of agency, clarifying that intentional giving could satiate some impulses to acquire, channeling resources into nourishment beyond the self. An insight crystallized. Managing influx requires not just strategy, but attunement to inner dialogues often drowned out by everyday distractions. Awareness of subtle shifts, whether swelling pride, quiet anxiety, or flash excitement, became a compass guiding calmer, more centered responses. Instead of reacting to stimuli outside, I learned to listen inward, cultivating a space between impulse and action where freedom quietly blossomed. Now, imagine confronting your own financial elevations with this lens, attending deeply to bodily sensations, internal narratives, and subtle moods that color your perception of abundance. Consider how these elements might influence choices below the surface, shaping your path toward either restraint or indulgence. This embodied approach offers a fresh vantage point to navigate fiscal complexity, turning fluctuations not into triggers for defeat, but opportunities for nuanced self-inquiry and growth. By embracing this unseen dimension, the interplay of mind, body, and money, I found my foothold in unfamiliar terrain strengthened. What once felt overwhelming now became a dance of awareness, a nuanced choreography inviting patience and kindness. Each step forward became less about control and more about connection to myself, my intentions, and the evolving relationship with the resources in my hands. When the unexpected bonus landed in my account, I expected relief, a clear sign of progress. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle restlessness began to stir. It felt like carrying a new weight, something unfamiliar and oddly unsettling. My nights grew restless, not because of fear of loss, but due to an unspoken pressure to manage this newfound influx perfectly, as if every decision carried a hidden moral test. This internal tension seemed disconnected from the digits on the screen and more rooted in a silent struggle with shifting self-expectations. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day, I found myself drawn to an expensive item, a sleek, modern watch I'd admired for months. The allure wasn't about utility, but an unacknowledged attempt to validate my worthiness in a language only I could hear. As I stood hesitating in the store, my mind spiraled into a silent argument. Buying it felt like embracing success, but simultaneously, a tiny voice whispered warnings about overindulgence, guilt, and eventual regret. The experience resembled standing at a forked path in a dense forest. One trail paved with pride, the other shadowed by anxiety. Neither offered clear guidance, leaving me paralyzed and internalizing frustration. Days later, I recalled the conversation with an old mentor who once told me, "Sometimes, money brings up old versions of ourselves we thought were buried." This idea lingered, prompting me to question whether the urge to spend reflected something deeper than material desire, a longing to rewrite identity narratives bound tightly to scarcity and inadequacy. Those inner stories, like stubborn roots beneath fertile soil, influenced the growth of my current habits without overt signals. Some transactions felt less transactional and more symbolic acts, expressions of unconscious dialogues with my self-image. To explore this, I embarked on a peculiar experiment. I began budgeting for emotion, deliberately allocating small sums to non-essential categories, yet attaching clear intentions and reflections to each choice. For instance, I dedicated a modest amount weekly to experiences that stirred joy without guilt. A walk in the botanical garden, a cup of artisan coffee, an hour spent reading. This practice revealed how intertwining conscious emotional nourishment with spending could gently recalibrate my reaction to financial abundance. Rather than impulsively grasping, I found space to savor and appreciate what was unfolding. One evening, I sat beside the fireplace, pen in hand, revisiting financial decisions through storytelling. Instead of cold spreadsheets, I sketched narratives for each transaction, why I made it, what feelings arose, and how it aligned with who I aspired to become. Writing these vignettes created a mosaic of insights, revealing recurring patterns of seeking approval and masking vulnerability behind quick gratification. This tangible connection between money and emotion unveiled a hidden dialogue, one in which my heart and wallet conversed without overt judgment, fostering empathy instead. A week later, during a dinner with an old friend who had taken a radically different path, trading corporate life for simpler earnings but richer emotional balance, I learned about his practice of aligned financial mindfulness. He described approaching his expenses as deliberate rituals, each expenditure a vote for the life he wished to live rather than a reaction to external stressors. This philosophy struck a chord. It portrayed money not as a source of anxiety or escape, but as a language articulating values and boundaries. In embracing this perspective, I glimpsed the possibility of shifting from a reactive spender to a discerning steward. This new lens changed my experience dramatically. Faced with potential purchases, I began imagining long-term ripple effects instead of momentary satisfaction. For instance, indecision over a costly gadget transformed into reflection on how the item fit or disrupted my broader goals. Occasionally, the choice was to abstain, an act of courage rooted not in deprivation, but in self-respect and clarity. These moments cultivated a growing resilience, an internal compass aligning action with emergent priorities, resulting in calmer evenings unshadowed by regret. At times, however, old impulses surged unexpectedly, especially during social gatherings where peer norms subtly encouraged conspicuous consumption. Once, at a colleague's celebration, offers to join expensive outings triggered an impulse spiral, one I had to consciously interrupt by excusing myself for fresh air and grounding breaths. These episodes highlighted how external environments could amplify internal vulnerabilities, underscoring the necessity of contextual awareness alongside self-inquiry. Through this ongoing engagement, I strengthened my capacity to navigate financial choices honorably within social dynamics. Moreover, I noticed that combining financial tracking with narrative reflection, pairing numeric clarity with emotional awareness, provided a fuller picture than either method alone. Charts and ledgers gave structure, while journaling revealed undercurrents influencing behaviors. This dual approach created a feedback loop where insight fostered intentional modifications and experience deepened self-knowledge. I came to appreciate that stewardship of resources entailed not only analysis, but embracing vulnerability and curiosity about the forces beneath transactions. Now, consider how these experiences resonate when you encounter unexpected funds or earnings. Could attending to emotional signals, personal stories, and social context transform how you express your new circumstances? Might framing financial decisions as contributions to your evolving identity reshape impulses into conscious acts? By exploring these dimensions, you tap into an inner architecture for change, one that integrates heart and mind, forging pathways toward lasting freedom from subconscious entanglements. As the days unfolded after my income increase, I began noticing subtle shifts in how my mind reacted to money's presence. There was an almost imperceptible tension simmering beneath my surface, like a tightly wound spring threatening to snap at the slightest provocation. I likened it to a seasoned orchestra struggling to synchronize when a new instrument unexpectedly joins the ensemble. Despite the added sound, the harmony momentarily faltered as the musicians adjusted, hesitated, and misread cues. That discord mirrored my internal landscape, my habitual financial rhythm disrupted by unfamiliar abundance, triggering a cascade of defensive instincts I wasn't yet equipped to recognize fully. In one vivid moment, I attended a networking event where colleagues casually discussed their recent promotions and bonuses. Their excitement sparkled, yet I felt a pang of envy mixed with anxiety. As others recounted spending plans brimming with ease and confidence, my mind conjured images of looming bills and unrelenting deadlines. It felt as if the new financial landscape was a foreign country with signs in a language I hadn't mastered. My thoughts raced to the safety of old survival strategies, slashing expenses hastily, hoarding savings obsessively, while simultaneously craving freedom I'd yet to grasp. This inner tug-of-war left me emotionally drained and socially isolated despite the external gains. Later, on a slow afternoon, an unexpected invitation arrived, a chance to collaborate on a passion project requiring upfront investment but promising long-term returns. My gut reaction wavered between excitement and paralysis. The logical me nudged toward opportunity. The protective me balked at risk and uncertainty. That resistance was not mere hesitation, but a vivid manifestation of my psyche's clash between growth desires and self-imposed limits. It dawned on me that embracing prosperity demanded courage to venture beyond familiar mental boundaries entrenched since childhood. Seeking clarity, I turned to a copy of a book on cognitive dissonance and was struck by a passage describing how people unconsciously seek harmony between beliefs and actions, often at the expense of new truths. This insight felt like catching a faint scent on the wind, something I knew was trailing me but hadn't quite noticed. Suddenly, my inconsistent behavior around money started to make sense as an attempt to restore balance between who I thought I was and who my increased income suggested I might become. This tension explained the uncanny way some months my credit card balances ballooned despite my best intentions. To explore this phenomenon further, I began a quiet experiment, tracking not only expenditures but also the mood and self-talk accompanying each transaction. The first few days revealed a pattern of reward spending triggered when self-doubt crept in, followed by waves of guilt and regret. It felt like trying to patch a leaking boat with paper, compensatory efforts that failed to address the root breach. Intriguingly, the very acts meant to alleviate stress often intensified it, creating a feedback loop I was eager to disentangle. At a cozy coffee shop one afternoon, deep in journaling and reflection, a metaphor came to me. My financial life resembled a garden overrun by tangled roots from decades ago, suffocating new growth. I imagined myself as a gardener tasked with identifying which roots nourished healthy blossoms and which strangled shoots. Some old beliefs, like scarcity mindsets, had seeped deep underground, influencing decisions invisibly yet powerfully. Recognizing this soil contamination compelled me to cultivate patience and gentle vigilance, removing deadwood without uprooting the entire system. Months into this internal landscaping, a breakthrough surfaced during a conversation with my partner. We discussed money candidly for the first time, weaving together hopes, fears, and unspoken expectations. That dialogue felt like a clearing in the forest, a space where light could filter through tangled branches. Sharing vulnerabilities softened defenses, making room for mutual support in adopting new attitudes about spending and saving. This shared journey highlighted that transformation isn't solitary. It thrives on connection, encouragement, and collective accountability. Subsequently, I challenged myself to harness the power of incremental change. Small adjustments, delaying impulse buys by 24 hours, practicing focused gratitude for essentials, visualizing financial goals vividly, accumulated like drops filling a reservoir. What once seemed overwhelming now felt accessible and sustainable. More importantly, the internal narrative shifted from scarcity-driven fear to cautious optimism. I began welcoming discomfort as the signpost of meaningful growth rather than a signal to retreat. Now, consider how your own psyche might respond to similar upheavals in financial status. Is there an internal orchestra temporarily out of sync, or tangled roots in your emotional garden requiring gentle tending? What conversations or experiments might you initiate to nurture understanding and cultivate harmony between the evolving external reality and the deep-seated stories shaping your behaviors? In exploring these questions, you embark on a transformational path where increased income becomes a catalyst not for chaos, but for a richer, more integrated sense of self. When the extra income started flowing in regularly, I noticed an unexpected shift, not just in how I handled money, but in how it intertwined with my sense of control. It was as if the newfound funds stirred dormant insecurities about my ability to manage abundance responsibly. I recall a night when I sat scrolling through my bank app, mesmerized by the numbers climbing higher than ever before, yet an undercurrent of doubt gnawed beneath my excitement. This wasn't just hesitation. It was a subtle resistance shaped by years of navigating scarcity, now colliding with the challenge of stewardship. That tension soon manifested physically. I began experiencing restless energy in moments that previously would have brought calm, like the quiet after work or during a leisurely weekend afternoon. It was a curious blend of alertness and unease, almost as though my body was bracing for turbulence amid smoother seas. This physiological response hinted at a deeper adaptation process, the brain struggling to reconcile the habits forged during lean times with the new reality of excess. Rather than welcoming this change, my nervous system seemed wired to anticipate loss, keeping me in a guarded, high alert state that sabotaged my capacity to relax and plan ahead thoughtfully. In one vivid instance, a casual invitation to a high-end dinner held in a lavish setting became a crucible for my shifting identity. Surrounded by friends reveling in luxury, I caught my mind drawing a dividing line between people who belong here and people like me. The clash between aspiration and self-perception created a brittle tension, undercutting my ability to fully engage or enjoy the moment. It wasn't just about social class. It was about the stories internalized about worth and belonging that financial status suddenly illuminated, forcing me to confront uncomfortable biases I hadn't acknowledged before. Later, I stumbled across a story about a woman earning a sizable income, yet living paycheck to paycheck due to the pressure of matching perceived expectations. That notion struck me. I began to see how my own spending sometimes acted like camouflage, a way to mask internal fears of inadequacy by buying into lifestyles that promised acceptance or status. This pattern was less about luxury and more about navigating the complex emotional currents tied to how I defined myself in relation to others. Money became both a shield and a spotlight, illuminating vulnerabilities I wasn't ready to face outright. Inspired, I experimented with small shifts in behavior. Rather than reacting impulsively to internal nudges, like the urge to treat myself after stressful days, I made it a point to translate those impulses into moments of mindfulness. For example, instead of rushing out to purchase something I didn't need, I paused to journal briefly about what desire or feeling surfaced beneath the impulse. Over time, I noticed the raw emotion decoded itself: loneliness, frustration, or a craving for connection rather than material reward. This awareness, subtle yet profound, began unraveling tangled motivations that had driven spending sprees masquerading as indulgence. A turning point arrived during a solo walk on an evening draped in autumn's crisp air. The golden light filtering through the trees caught my attention, prompting a meditation on what abundance could mean beyond numbers and possessions. I imagined my financial situation as a river, sometimes rushing, sometimes calm, but always shaped by the contours of the environment it flowed through. Recognizing that my behaviors were like bends in that river, influenced by early landscapes of scarcity and expectation, opened a new doorway. I could reshape those banks, gradually redirecting the current toward a steadier, more nourishing flow. With this metaphor in mind, I began cultivating rituals that honored this emerging relationship. One practice involved setting aside a small, fixed gratitude fund each month, a designated pool used exclusively for experiences or items that genuinely enhance my well-being, no strings attached. This act wasn't about restriction, but about consciously valuing what mattered, creating a deliberate buffer against impulsiveness. The effect was unexpectedly liberating. Having a designated outlet for joy reduced the frantic energy that once propelled reckless spending, soothing internal turbulence with intentional delight. During a conversation with a trusted friend, I shared how my interactions with money were evolving. Their response lingered. "You're learning to treat your finances as a reflection of your inner world, not just a ledger of transactions." That insight crystallized something I had sensed but struggled to express fully. Instead of measuring success solely through accumulation or austerity, I was discovering that money mastery calls for emotional fluency, a capacity to listen without judgment and respond with clarity. Embracing this perspective transformed financial behavior into an act of self-care, weaving together psychological insight and practical action seamlessly. Imagine yourself at a crossroads where extra income arrives, accompanied by these complex waves of emotion and identity questioning. How might you harness this inner dialogue to craft responses that honor both your history and your future aspirations? Could nurturing gentle curiosity about impulses and beliefs foster a steadiness that supports wise allocation while nurturing self-worth? Engaging with these questions invites a richer, more nuanced navigation of growth, where financial expansion becomes a pathway to deeper understanding rather than a trigger for confusion. Money, I came to understand, carries a language far richer and more complex than I initially imagined. On one occasion, I found myself at a garage sale, sifting through dusty albums and mismatched trinkets. Amongst the clutter, a faded photograph caught my eye. an image of my grandmother standing proudly beside a worn, handmade quilt. As I held that photograph, a flood of unspoken stories rushed through me. Stories of sacrifice, resilience, and a profound sense of scarcity etched into family history. Suddenly, my impulse to spend with abandon no longer seemed merely irrational. It was deeply rooted in inherited scripts written long before I took up the ledger. Later, sitting in my quiet living room, I pondered how these ancestral echoes shaped my monetary impulses. Wealth accumulated swiftly, yet vanished mysteriously, slipping through fingers tangled in invisible webs woven by past generations. Each unplanned purchase, each unexpected bill, suddenly appeared as a reenactment of survival tactics passed down like fragile heirlooms. The mind's patterns, I understood, were not isolated. They were family relics, carrying messages of not enough disguised beneath layers of well-intentioned protection. One afternoon, during a rare trip to the library, I stumbled upon a book detailing the neuroscience behind habit formation, a revelation that illuminated dark corners of my psyche. The brain's pathways, created over time, function as grooves worn into rock. New money flowing into my accounts activated old, deeply etched routes favoring immediate gratification or avoidance of discomfort. This explained why sudden financial improvements triggered restlessness or dissatisfaction. My neural circuitry was still tuned for survival under scarcity, reacting to abundance with mistrust and rapid depletion. A pivotal moment unfolded when I started tracking not just spending, but the internal speeches accompanying each transaction. Writing down what I told myself, whether it was, "I've earned this," or "money doesn't last," brought to light conflicting voices battling within. These mental dialogues shaped demand for validation or safety, which in turn pressured me towards decisions undermining my broader goals. I began viewing my budget as a battlefield where old fears and new aspirations wrestled, requiring tender negotiation rather than authoritarian control. Simultaneously, a curious friend introduced me to somatic awareness, encouraging me to notice bodily reactions tied to money moments. The rise in heartbeat before checking my balance, the tightness in my chest when reviewing bills, or the fleeting warmth after spontaneous shopping trips, all embodied experiences adding texture to my understanding. This integration of mind and body unveiled money's role as messenger of unspoken emotions, rather than purely abstract data demanding management. In one particularly revealing conversation, I confessed to a mentor the confusion sparked by increased income paired with growing debt. Their response lingered. "Your money story isn't only about numbers. It's an emotional manuscript waiting to be revised." That insight empowered me to approach finances as a personal narrative, one that could be edited with compassion rather than condemnation. It encouraged curiosity instead of self-judgment, transforming challenges into opportunities for rewriting limiting beliefs. To test this approach, I began crafting rituals around new earnings, small, meaningful ceremonies marking receipt of income. Lighting a candle, expressing gratitude, or setting a clear intention for use of funds infused each paycheck with purpose beyond mere arithmetic. These acts anchored my awareness, slowing the rush to automatically disperse resources in reactive bursts. Over time, they created patterns signaling respect and presence, gradually weakening destructive impulses seated in distant memories. Yet, growth was neither linear nor painless. Encounters with temptation became mirrors reflecting unresolved tensions. At a bustling mall, the magnetic attraction of sales and flashy ads provoked lingering ambivalence. Some part of me yearned to belong to that world, while another recoiled at its excess. Navigating that internal chasm demanded patience and renewed self-compassion, recognizing that embracing abundance entailed surrendering old defenses and stepping into unfamiliar terrain. Now, consider how this perspective might shift your experience when more income flows in. Could you listen attentively for ancestral echoes guiding your behavior? Might you start noticing bodily signals as early warnings or invitations? Envision honoring your money as a storied entity alive with emotion, history, and potential transformation. Embracing this layered awareness invites a gentle unraveling of inherited chains, opening space for new patterns to bloom, each spending decision becoming not just a transaction, but a dialogue with your evolving self. Reflecting on this journey so far, I often find my thoughts drifting to a river I once encountered during a quiet hike. Its surface both tranquil and restless, concealing currents weaving patterns beneath. The streams of insight we've been tracing have similarly converged beneath the surface of my awareness, crafting a complex tapestry of emotions, memories, and beliefs. At times, it seems as though my mind is a vast chamber of mirrors, each fracturing and refracting different fragments of my story. I've felt the weight of invisible threads tugging me toward old habits, even as newfound clarity beckoned me onward. This tension, neither adversarial nor harmonious, embodies the paradox of growth, the simultaneous pull of comfort within familiar confines and the trembling anticipation of uncharted terrain. The deeper I ventured into these internal landscapes, the more I noticed how the boundaries separating emotion, identity, and action began to dissolve, blending into a singular dance of influence and reflection. Money, elusive and silent, transformed from a mere transactional figure into a messenger whispering secrets about my inner world. Its movements, once external and objective, revealed themselves as reflections of my evolving narrative, sometimes steady and assured, at other times chaotic and uncertain. The recognition that these currents were less about external circumstances and more about the subtle interplay of internal patterns brought a quiet reverence to what had seemed mundane before. It invited me to observe with tenderness the quiet dialogues my mind choreographed in the face of abundance and constraint alike. I recall moments when this internal dance became particularly vivid. Sitting in the evening hush of my home, I would catch myself oscillating between exhilaration at newfound opportunities and an inexplicable hesitation anchored deep within. It was as though a shadow, cast long ago, followed me, softening the edges of celebration with traces of caution. Yet the shadows were not enemies. They held wisdom, reminders of survival and resilience woven through my experience. Recognizing their presence without yielding to them required a delicate balance, an act of courage cradled by patience. Each hesitation carried a story worth listening to, a chapter in a larger narrative seeking integration rather than suppression. In these quieter spaces, I began to appreciate the complexity of instinct and intention entwined in my responses. Impulses that seemed impulsive revealed themselves as urgent messengers from layers of memory and emotion. Decisions that once appeared irrational gained texture when viewed through the lens of identity and self-perception. I found myself less inclined to judge these forces and more curious about what they guarded and what they yearned to protect. This shift held a transformational power. It invited a kind of dialogue where judgment loosened its grip and empathy took root. Through this process, my relationship to money mirrored a broader reconciliation, a weaving together of disparate parts seeking harmony. As awareness deepened, so did the realization that freedom in relation to abundance would not emerge from control or denial alone. It required an embrace of complexity, a willingness to hold conflicting emotions without collapsing into confusion. I began to notice how the textures of my daily experiences, joy, anxiety, pride, doubt, wove themselves into a rich fabric lending greater meaning to each choice, each moment of restraint or release. The journey shifted from a battle to be won into a craft to be practiced, where self-understanding informed each step and mistakes became stitches in a growing tapestry of wisdom. Walking through this renewed terrain, I encountered new questions emerging quietly beneath the surface. How might I honor the intricate dialogues playing out within me, while also stepping forward into possibilities previously unseen? Could I cultivate an inner container spacious enough to hold uncertainty and courage simultaneously? These questions did not demand immediate answers, but opened invitations to explore with gentleness and honest curiosity. In approaching the unknown not as an adversary, but as a partner, I discovered nascent strength, the kind that softens fear without surrendering hope. Imagine yourself at a similar crossroads, tenderly attending to the countless unseen threads shaping your experience. Sense the hidden choreography beneath impulses, the subtle rhythm linking past pain to present possibility. In this awareness, a kind of spaciousness unfolds, a room within where transformation can unfold organically. Here lies the threshold before the door swings open onto a vista where your relationship to money and self can imagine new languages, where old stories can loosen their hold, and a new harmony beckons. I stand with you on this cusp, feeling the pulse of potential resonate quietly beneath the surface, ready to rise when we are poised to receive it. There was a moment, late one evening, when I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker like restless fireflies, and in that quiet solitude, a realization settled over me. Money is far less about numbers or status than it is about the intricate dance within ourselves. It's a mirror reflecting our hidden fears, unspoken desires, and the silent agreements we've made with our past. It's in that stillness that I understood why no external increase had ever truly freed me. Because the chains I carried were forged in the shadows of my own beliefs, threading through memories, emotions, and identity itself. I recall the weight of contradiction swirling inside me, how anticipation for financial progress often stirred an undercurrent of resistance, like a secret guardian holding me hostage to familiar stories. But those stories, I came to see, were not barriers to crush. They were fragile messages coded in survival instincts, waiting for empathy and acknowledgement. When I started to listen to myself with genuine curiosity, without layers of judgment or haste, I began uncovering the language of these inner voices. They spoke not with condemnation but with concern, urging caution as I stepped into unfamiliar territory. This transformation, the shift from struggle to dialogue within, became the fulcrum on which meaningful change balanced. One evening, I leafed through a worn journal filled with fragments of my journey, moments of hesitation, bursts of hope, blurred lines between courage and fear. The entries revealed how my relationship with money had been a secret stage where identities collided and harmonized in fragile balance. I realized that growth demanded embracing ambiguity, challenging the allure of quick fixes, and cultivating resilience through sustained self-awareness. The path wasn't linear or easy. It was more like tracing the contours of a vast, shifting landscape where every bend promised a new horizon yet invited reflections on what had been left behind. In conversations with friends who shared similar struggles, I noticed a common thread: the experience of being caught between the comfort of old patterns and the call of new possibilities. We spoke of the paradox of abundance that sometimes feels suffocating rather than liberating. But within these exchanges, an implicit understanding blossomed: that the journey toward financial well-being is inseparable from healing the fractured narratives inside us. Money, we realized, is an invitation to reimagine ourselves, to rewrite the internal scripts that govern our steps in unseen ways. This realization invites a gentle yet profound question. What if true financial freedom begins not when the account balance grows, but when our internal stories shift to welcome abundance as familiar terrain? What if the restless energy and confusion become guides instead of obstacles? Envisioning this possibility demands courage and grace. The courage to face the discomfort of change and the grace to accept imperfection along the way. In this dance between holding and releasing, between knowing and not knowing, we discover a new rhythm, one that carries us toward authentic empowerment. As I write these words, I invite you to consider your own delicate dialogues with money. Notice the subtle currents steering your choices, the often quiet emotions coloring your financial landscape. What stories emerge when you reflect with openness? Which voices need to be heard and honored? Change begins when we open the door to these inner sanctuaries, lighting them with awareness and letting compassion lead us through. It's there, in the interplay between shadow and light, that real transformation roots itself, quietly, persistently, profoundly. Our journey toward financial clarity and liberation is as much about presence as it is about planning, as much about self-kindness as it is about strategy. This path calls us to become attentive witnesses of our own experience, nurturing the fragile seedlings of new beliefs until they bloom into steady trees. Along the way, we learn that money is more than currency. It's a storyteller, a teacher, a reflection of the deeper currents steering our lives. Gifted with this understanding, we can finally allow abundance to flow, not as an external prize to be chased, but as an internal state to be cultivated, cherished, and lived. In the quiet moments ahead, May you meet your financial self with open arms and thoughtful eyes. Embrace the complexities, the contradictions, the lessons silently woven into your history with money. And step forward with gentle resolve, knowing that every conscious choice you make is a stitch repairing the tapestry of your inner world, weaving a fabric rich with freedom, hope, and enduring peace.